Hello, everybody. Welcome, and we appreciate you joining us today. I'm Gordy Bannister, and I'll be leading today's discussion on compensation risk assessments. In a recent survey done by the NACD, one of the most important areas for board improvement was identified by directors as the oversight of risk management, which of course takes a lot of different forms. The Compensation Committee's annual comp risk assessment is a required exercise, and many do treat it as such. Today we have Steve Huber and Lisa Shaw from Pearl Meyer with us, and we're going to talk today about how to make this yearly evaluation more than a sort of tick the box or check the box exercise, and one that may truly help identify some of the key risk areas within your organization in the areas of compensation as well as leadership. However, before we start the program, I want to turn over to Marie Canizales with NACD, who has some housekeeping items to cover. Marie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Gordy, and welcome everyone. As you'll see, the Pearl Meyer team has put together some really informative information here for you in this presentation, and I'm sure it's going to drive some of the questions among you. So in order to do so, please submit your questions by clicking the Q&A button on the right of your screen and ask that question. We have built a little bit of time in the end for Q&A, but if we don't get to your question, we'll share your email with the experts at Pearl Meyer so that they can respond directly to you in the next couple days. The number one question that we always get is if this webinar and the slides are available. As always, a recording of this webinar will be available early next week at nacdonline.org/webinars and on the Pearl Meyer website as well. You can also access the presentation slides over on the right side where you see resources, along with some key thought leadership pieces from Pearl Meyer. These will also be available in our post-webinar emails that you receive from NACD after the event. So, for those of you who are certified directors and fellows, your participation in today's live webinar earns you 1 credit towards maintaining your NACD credential. You'll automatically receive that credit for your participation. Please note that you must attend this webinar for at least 50 minutes to receive credit. Speaking of our NACD Director Certification Program, if you're interested in learning more about it and setting yourself apart as a high performance director, this designation is such a wonderful way to do that. So just check out our webpage or contact your membership advisor at credentialing@nacdonline.org. Finally, at the end of the webinar, we have a few evaluation questions, and we'd love for you to provide your feedback. It's the only way that we can really make these webinars better, and it's also a great way for you to let us know what you might want to look forward to in the future. We also have some polling questions. So for those of you seeking CPE credit, please make sure to answer 3 of the 4 poll questions. So with that, let me pass it over to our experts. Steve, why don't you get us started?
Sure. Thank you for the introduction. And let's just start with a little bit of background. So if we can move forward a couple slides here. I want to start with, why do we need to conduct this compensation risk assessment exercise anyway? So the background on this is that one of the compensation related regulations that came out of Dodd-Frank back in the day was that public companies are required to conduct a compensation risk assessment every year. So Gordy had mentioned off the top that, this is a required exercise. That's why we do it. There's some mandatory aspect of it, but how can we find value in what's a mandatory exercise and make sure that we're coming at this from a comprehensive, holistic point of view where we're identifying material risks and making sure that there is value beyond just checking the box and making sure we do this mandated exercise. So when a company does a compensation risk assessment, as I'm sure many of you, the audience, have participated in, you're required to search for what's called material adverse risk in your compensation plans. If you identify material adverse risk in your compensation plans, you're required to disclose that in your proxy statement. So what happens, I would say 99% of the time, is that companies conduct this exercise. They find that there's not material adverse risk present in their compensation plans, and they go ahead and disclose, we conducted a compensation risk assessment, no significant risks were identified, And by the way, our friends at ISS and Glass Lewis check this to make sure that we are confirming that we're following the regulation and conducting this risk assessment. So the SEC gives companies lots of flexibility in how that assessment is done. They just want to make sure that it's done. But how can we move beyond, again, this mandated exercise and work towards a framework that allows us to really drill into the compensation plans and their structure to make sure that we aren't inadvertently introducing material adverse risk to our programs. So moving beyond background, I want to talk about this concept of the fox guarding the hen house. And this is a conversation that came up in a compensation committee meeting that I was sitting in earlier this year. And it was, really salient point that had never been raised, with either me or my colleague that was present at the meeting before. We were sitting with a compensation committee and presenting the findings of our compensation risk assessment for this company. And the compensation committee chair sort of interrupted us and said, I have a question for you all. We know that you're sitting here today aiming to provide an independent third-party review of our programs, but as our independent compensation consultant, aren't you a bit biased as you do this exercise? After all, you helped us design these programs. So how can we be sure that you're truly objective when you tell us our programs are free of material adverse risk? And conversely, you all may have been part of exercises before where a management team leads the risk assessment of their own programs. So how can we be sure that a management team that helps design and administer compensation plans is also being objective when they're reviewing programs for this degree of risk? And to me, this was a really profound point that this compensation committee chair raised. And it got my colleague and I to thinking about how do we ensure that there's objectivity in this process? Either companies are self-assessing their programs or we're helping them to assess programs that we had a hand in designing. So when we undertake this exercise, what are the safeguards we can put in place to make sure that we truly are being objective? So right off the bat, you can see the top point on this list is that we strive to empower our compensation committees to strengthen the oversight process behind this. Our compensation committee chair in this anecdote that I shared, raising her hand in the middle of our assessment and saying, hold on a minute, I want to drill a bit into how this process was conducted. That is great. It's the type of feedback that we look for in a compensation risk assessment that really makes it valuable. Not just going to the compensation committee and saying, the SEC mandates us to do this exercise and we found that no material adverse risk is present. Let's move to the next agenda item. No, truly having an open discussion and not being afraid to allow compensation committee members or members of the management team to raise their hand and weigh in on the process itself behind the compensation risk assessment is crucial to ensuring an objective process. Transparency behind the risk assessment, you can see number 2 here on this list. Whoever conducts the compensation risk assessment, whether it's a management-led exercise or a consultant-led exercise, have a clear documented process so that compensation committee members have an understanding of everything that went into the compensation risk assessment. They know the depth of the review, how far down into the organization it went. They know which elements of the compensation program were reviewed. They know how we ensured that to the extent that there is risk within the compensation programs, that there are mitigating factors. So just transparency throughout the process, laying it all out in the necessary level of detail to give that comfort to people that folks that otherwise may have a conflict of interest in running this assessment are truly coming at it from as objective a point of view as possible. Finally, stakeholder input and auditing the review itself. Stakeholder input, as with any process, we want to value all different perspectives, whether it's from compensation committee members themselves. Maybe you have a colleague that manages a bunch of compensation plans at a key business unit that as an HR leader or as a compensation committee member, you don't have a lot of insight into, but that business unit leader may be able to participate and say, hey, there are these sales incentive plans that you may not have a lot of awareness of, but I have a unique perspective on how we can strengthen some of the processes and controls behind these plans. So opening up the compensation risk assessment to more viewpoints, we always find to be helpful. As to auditing the reviews, we aren't necessarily talking about, hiring an audit firm or another third party to come in and audit the compensation risk assessment process itself. But every once in a while, kicking the tires on that process to understand, are we keeping up with the market in terms of, the depth of the review, the things that we're considering in the review. Maybe if you're an HR leader, you can call another HR leader that's in your network to say, hey, our compensation risk assessment is getting a little stale. We've been following the same process year after year. Can you tell me a bit about what you do at your company? And maybe we can learn from some of your best practices and incorporate those in our reviews. So again, there's always going to be some degree of the fox guarding the hen house when you have management reviewing plans that they've designed, or a consultant reviewing plans that they've had a part in designing as well. So ensuring that there is these four, type of safeguards present within the review process helps to ensure an objective review.
Yeah, and Steve, if I would jump in here, I would say that I'm delighted that in the company that you talked about, there's a culture where the compensation committee chair chose to intervene to ask the question. And so, there is where the fox guarding the hen house actually has to be absolutely managed and the risk mitigated, because the people who sit on the compensation committee, who are independent directors, need to exercise their resolve in asking the critical questions necessary around the risk assessment. That's how you can completely ensure and assure, quite frankly, that there's no situation where this is being biased either by the management team or biased by the consultant who's doing it, the third party who's doing it. Asking the right critical questions in an open format, in a transparent way, because transparency breeds accountability, is the way to make that happen. So that's my advice to all the directors who are listening to this thing today.
Yeah, thank you, Gordy. And I think that's a great segue to our first poll question. And that question is, who drives your company's annual compensation risk review? You can see we've laid out a few options here. So number one, is it a management or HR team-led exercise? Option two, does your consultant really take the lead? Option three, maybe it's a true 50-50 partnership between options 1 and 2. Or perhaps option 4, maybe there's another third party that gets involved, whether it's another compensation consultant or the audit committee, some other third party. So interested to see what the results might be here. And while we wait for these answers to trickle in, Gordy, why don't you talk a bit about your experience on comp committees and the process you're most familiar with?
Yeah, so I would say that it's an annual process. It takes place generally in the fall, or sort of in the last quarter before the end of the fiscal year, when you're going to deliver compensation. And in the places I've been, a third party has always been involved, and sort of third party has always been in the lead on it. And so what we do is then have a dashboard where there's 8 or 9, 10 elements that on the dashboard have red, yellow, and green, and we get a chance to actually ask questions. And it covers the totality of compensation across the whole organization. So it's not just the executive team when it comes to this assessment of the risk. It has to do with everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Gordy. And as I'm seeing the responses come in here, there's a good spread across options 1, 2, and 3. Not so much prevalence on option 4, but management HR-led exercise about 30% of the time, independent comp consultant about 26% of the time. But the leading vote getter is that collaboration option with over 40% of the vote result there. So none of them necessarily have a majority, but there is a plurality on option number 3. And I would also note, in my experience, companies that do have a management-led exercise or a consultant-led exercise, there still is some degree of verification and, at least over-the-shoulder review. If it's the consultant, managing the exercise, the HR team might look over the shoulder and say, all right, this looks reasonable, or vice versa. So there is always some degree of collaboration. Moving on to how we conduct the compensation risk assessment itself. What's laid out here on this slide is really 2 distinct approaches on different ends of the spectrum. One is what I would consider to be the more requirement or compliance-oriented approach, and that's the checklist approach. So the checklist approach is a more binary, bare-bones assessment that involves using a predefined list of potential problematic features that could exist within a compensation plan, and simply going down that checklist and saying, does this problematic feature exist within our program? No, great, on to the next one. So that assessment may meet the SEC requirement of, kicking the tires on your compensation plans to make sure there's not material adverse risk, but it misses a lot of nuance. It ignores the fact that there may be risk present within one aspect of a program, but that there's a mitigating feature within another aspect of the program that may make that level of risk, more acceptable. Conversely, when we think about taking a more holistic approach to a compensation risk assessment, that's where on the right side of this page, you see the spectrum approach laid out. So this side of the approach recognizes that a compensation risk assessment isn't always going to be binary, black and white. There's no risk present here, or there's a lot of risk present here. Sometimes it's different shades of gray in the middle. So this spectrum approach will look at different policies, practices, or program features and assign them a grade of, low risk, moderate risk, high risk, or maybe somewhere in between, and use that in the entire context of the compensation program, governance features, and other mitigating factors that might serve to counterbalance some degree of risk. Because as we all know, any well-designed compensation program is going to have incentive programs and other features that contain some degree of risk. The goal here is not to remove risk from the compensation program, but to make sure that we're comfortable with the degree of risk that exists within the program. So for example, you can see laid out here on the page, a company might have a combined chairman and CEO role. Advisory firms will, call that out and say, you have a centralized, figure with a lot of power. How do you mitigate against that risk to make sure that there's not one figure that's too influential on company policy, compensation designs and practices? And in that case, we might say, well, we have an independent board, we have a strong lead independent director, and we have other mitigating factors that serve as a check and balance. So there's going to be, multiple instances as you go down this list of compensation plans, compensation features, where you're going to say, yeah, there's some risk involved here, but here's how we balance against that risk. And making sure that those mitigating factors exist within the plan is really, to me, the heart of the review. Not to remove risk, but to make sure that we're comfortable with the level of risk and the checks and balances.
Yeah, and Steve, I think, so I alluded to it in the last question that you asked me, but personally, I sort of prefer the spectrum approach. And then underneath each one of these areas that you're looking at with respect to compensation risk, whether it's pay mix, performance metrics, equity incentives, individual performance assessments, those kinds of things. Under each one of those, there can kind of be a listing of what are the things that we're sort of looking at, what are the things that we're assessing. And then you can attach, if you will, again, in a sort of a dashboard fashion, a red, green, or a yellow to that without going through what I would declare probably this massive exercise of, each individual line item. Personally, as a director, I've never liked the idea of bringing to the board these individual line items. It's more about, in the context of the broader system, what are the critical things under that, and then do we feel like we're doing well or not? And if we're not doing well, if you get a red on something, what are the actions that have to be taken to modify that?
Yeah, well said, Gordy. And I think that's a great segue to our next slide, where we go into a bit more detail on the spectrum approach. So I don't mean to imply that when you view risk on a spectrum that you're just sort of putting your thumb in the air and saying, all right, we're somewhere in the middle. Good, let's move on. You can still take the approach where you're looking at different items of the compensation plan discretely. One at a time, you can move down the list and say, what are elements of our short-term incentive plan design? How do they score on the low to high risk spectrum? Let's look at our long-term incentive plan design. Let's look at some of the features and governance protocols that we have in place within our compensation plans. And when you view items discretely and score them on that sort of low to high risk plane, it introduces a level of context to the review that isn't necessarily in place if you're simply following a checklist. So when we conduct this type of review, if an item is low risk, it means, all right, great, there's really no action that needs to be taken. If it scores moderate risk, it might mean that there are certain features that lack controls or limits, but generally it's not an item that needs to be acted on, potentially monitored moving forward. But it's really when an item scores high risk that you're really going to want to think, all right, are there really strong mitigating factors in place to balance this high risk? And if not, how can we review and ameliorate this potentially problematic practice? Now I want to move into a case study, because to this point, we've discussed compensation risk in somewhat abstract or hypothetical terms. And it's tough when you're sitting reviewing a plan just on paper to say, theoretically or hypothetically, how could this plan design present risk to our organization? A lot of the time, the risks don't identify themselves until they become a real problem. So in that vein, I think if we look at a recent high-profile case that could teach us some valuable lessons, some of you may be familiar with the Chemours incentive compensation scandal that broke earlier this year. And really what happened here was there was an investigation at Chemours, which was triggered by an anonymous ethics hotline report that essentially said executives were manipulating how and when they received year-end payments from vendors or delivered year-end payments to vendors to impact free cash flow targets that were tied to their incentive compensation plans. So again, this is the type of thing where if we were conducting a compensation risk assessment for a company that had a free cash flow metric within its compensation plans, it might not necessarily be apparent that there could be a flaw within a compensation plan design like this, but when you see a high-profile case where an incentive program was manipulated and created some material adverse risk for the company, it creates an opening for a compensation committee to have the discussion about, all right, what can we learn from this scandal that happened down the street to make sure that we have the controls in place so something similar doesn't happen at our company. And in fact, a lot of the compensation committees I advise, we're talking about this case in particular, particularly those companies that had a cash flow metric within their plan. They would say to the HR team, what sort of controls do we have in place to make sure that, our incentive programs can't be similarly gamed? Or maybe they talk to a compensation committee member that also happens to sit on the audit committee of how are we ensuring that there's, good corporate hygiene and all those other things that you want within, the measurement of a financial performance metric that impacts incentive plan payouts. So the case really highlights a lot of important considerations, and learning from real world examples to take it from the abstract to the practical is especially helpful. So moving on to some of the implications from that case study. So again, it's really, to me, it's a stark reminder that while we're mandated to conduct a compensation risk assessment on an annual basis, reviewing compensation risk once a year, frankly, isn't enough. To prevent similar issues from happening at the companies that I advise, we always talk about, let's think about risk as we administer and design compensation plans throughout the year. Risk should always be at the forefront of any conversations we have when we're designing an incentive plan, especially to make sure that we don't inadvertently introduce material adverse risk to our plans. And we aren't only thinking about that material adverse risk as part of the compensation risk assessment, which again only happens on an annual basis. So you can see some of the key points that we've laid out here. Number one, ongoing vigilance. Again, this means regularly reviewing and updating compensation practices to identify those risks, really just keeping our eyes open and staying proactive rather than being reactive. On that point about being proactive, compensation committees should regularly make a habit of evaluating incentive plan designs, really probing on any potential changes to incentive plan designs to make sure that risk is a key component of that review. Learning from incidents, as we just discussed with the Chemours case, using real world examples to refine and enhance our compensation strategies, learning those valuable lessons that can inform practices moving forward. And finally, establish a partnership with an independent compensation consultant that's going to bring these issues to your attention. A lot of the committees that I work with have a standing agenda item for us as their independent compensation consultant to say, hey, what's going on in the world of executive compensation? Tell me about this Elon Musk Tesla case. Tell me about this Chemours case. What should we know from these incidents, and how can we learn from them? So by implementing these strategies, we really strive to ensure that our approach to compensation risk is dynamic and responsive and helps to prevent issues before they arise.
Yeah, I guess the piece that I'd add on this one, Steve, is that so generally the comp committee is looking at the results of the long term and the short term on a quarterly basis. And so if you have in the back of your head the overall sort of risk assessment process and the implications of that on the sort of the trends of the financial results of the business, you can kind of marry that on a quarter by quarter basis and see whether it looks like something looks kind of squirrely or not. And I think when at the point in time when you get to the end of the year or in the middle of the year, when you're sort of looking at, do we need to make changes to the compensation plan? And we all ask ourselves, okay, so over the last 5 years or the last 10 years, is the compensation system delivering what we expect it to? And we look at those trends, you can see whether or not anomalies are popping up that would show up in the risk assessment around whether somebody was trying to gain year-end compensation based on cash flow numbers or something like that. Mm-hmm. So there's a way that compensation committee members with the right level of awareness can be digging into this on a more routine, regular basis beyond just when the risk assessment is actually performed and presented to the committee.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think one of the key learnings from the Chemours case was that their incentive plan design was structured such that achieving a threshold level of performance resulted in a 50% of target bonus payout. So that one additional dollar of free cash flow that resulted in you going from below threshold to above threshold resulted in some significant paydays for executives. So perhaps thinking about how we thoughtfully structure the incentive plan curve itself so that we don't have those aggressive changes in payout built in, or those opportunities to really game the system just for an additional dollar of earnings here or whatever the case may be. We can also mitigate and manage risk just from how we design the plans themselves. One other item I want to touch on, if we can move to the next slide, that frequently comes up when we're conducting compensation risk assessments is the depth of the review itself. So what we didn't mention earlier when we were providing the background on the SEC requiring that we look at compensation plans is that they aren't requiring us only to look at executive compensation plans. They're requiring that we look at compensation plans throughout the entire organization to understand whether there's material adverse risk. So a lot of the time, what we find is that the compensation committee's charter might be focused solely on executive compensation programs, or it might define its purview as being only compensation plans that impact the CEO and the CEO's direct reports, or even a more narrow scope like only named executive officers. So that's fine and dandy when it comes to approving pay levels and incentive plan designs and all of that. But what's missed is that in this compensation risk assessment process, there's an understanding or an expectation from the SEC that the compensation committee is reviewing plans below the executive level throughout the entire organization. So I always point to the Wells Fargo example as a case where compensation plans below the executive level, in this case it was branch level employees, created significant material adverse risk for the company and resulted in a lot of financial and reputational damage. So these were aggressive sales targets that were tied to opening new accounts for branch level employees, and what it resulted in was a lot of fraudulent account openings. So in reality, there's no expectation that a compensation committee member would have been aware of this particular compensation plan that affected branch level employees. But when it comes to the point of empowering compensation committees to really probe into the process itself, perhaps if the compensation committee had, been more in tune with the compensation risk assessment process itself, they might have asked the question to whichever party was conducting the risk assessment, to what extent are we thinking about our branch level compensation programs? To what extent are you reviewing plans and policies below the executive level? And if they weren't satisfied with that answer, maybe it would have resulted in a probe that went further down into the organization. So the executive focus is understandable because of the committee's purview, but it's limiting and it may not capture all the potential forms of risk.
Yeah, so this is this was one of the hardest ones for me, and that is to sort of be sure that we are asking in the risk assessment process and through the compensation process, tell us a little bit about what goes on at the front lines. Now, the board will be made aware of big negotiations with bargaining units and things of that nature. But it took me a little bit to kind of I think it was around the Wells Fargo time when it sort of dawned on me as a compensation committee member and chair that, hey, I need to be asking questions about what is actually taking place on the front lines, as it applies to sales and marketing and other sorts of incentives that are occurring at the front lines. And so sometimes it's hard for directors for us to get our heads around asking about stuff at the front lines because we tend to spend most of our time in the C-suite with respect to comp, but we do have to ask those questions and just assure ourselves that it's being handled properly.
Yeah, and to that point, I want to open it up to the audience for our second polling question. And that polling question is, to what extent does your company ensure that incentive plans for non-executive employees are included in the annual comp risk assessment? So we've arrayed options 1 through 4, where at the top of the list, we have compensation risk assessments focusing almost solely on executive compensation, down to the bottom of the list, where it's really more all-inclusive review of broad-based compensation plans, executive compensation plans. So interested to see where we all fall on this spectrum. And Gordy, I know you talked a bit about your experience and how it was somewhat eye-opening for you. In your experience, where would you say your compensation committees fall between options 1 and 4 here?
Now I would say we absolutely ask those questions. But I think before the Wells Fargo thing, I think it was a lot less. People didn't spend, at least in my experience, a lot of time asking about what was going on at the front lines. But post Wells Fargo, most people do, at least that I've been around.
Right, and as I'm looking at the responses now, I see, a good spread again of, differing practices here. The majority vote getter was option B, where, HR teams or independent consultants are kicking the tires on the non-executive plan, so they're considered as part of the review. But again, they aren't a major focus. And frankly, I think that makes sense. When you think about where material adverse risk could come from, it's going to be executive compensation plans that are most scrutinized, most substantial. But I think, as we talked about with Wells Fargo, for those of you that might have indicated option 1, where you're focusing solely on executive compensation plans, maybe you want to consider including a more comprehensive review, at least every other year, if it's not practical to do so on an annual basis. So I want to shift gears a little bit and move sort of a segue into the next phase of our discussion, which is how executive succession planning, leadership and talent development, might be part of this compensation risk assessment exercise. And the segue to me is that over time, especially in recent years, the compensation committee's remit, as all of you are keenly aware, has expanded to include areas besides compensation, areas besides executive compensation. We're talking about ESG, DE&I, talent management, succession planning. And I've provided some statistics here on the page where 61% of public companies surveyed in a recent Pearl Meyer survey noted that they consider executive succession planning to be part of the compensation committee's purview. And the majority of those companies further reported a moderate to high level of involvement in these broader human capital management areas. So it sort of begs the question, to what extent should succession planning be viewed as part of the annual compensation risk assessment if succession planning is part of the compensation committee's purview? And to that end, I'm going to turn the discussion over to my colleague, Lisa Shaw.
Thanks so much, Stephen. So it's time for our third polling question, which is going to get at this point and see, to what extent does your current compensation risk assessment process consider issues of succession planning and/or leadership and talent development? So some risk assessments focus solely on traditional compensation risks. There's some where you dabble in this a little bit, but it's not really integrated into the risk assessment. Moderately, where succession planning and talent development are regular components, but it's not the primary focus. And then for some, it's very extensive, where it's really central to the risk assessment process to make sure that there's alignment with the organization's goals. So as you're answering this, Gordy, I'd love to hear from you, your experience and how extensive you've seen this on the risk assessments you've been a part of.
Yes, so I would say it's been a mixed bag. The places I think that operate in a world-class fashion are the ones who do include this. Because at the end of the day, when you're working on succession planning and executive development, how those people are paid and sort of the trajectory of their compensation is an aspect of what you think their future is going to be. Mm-hmm. And you're comparing them against the marketplace, whatever benchmark you choose to go against, whether it's the 50th percentile or whatever. And so if you aren't factoring that into the overall compensation risk assessment, there's a gap in my mind. So I think where this works in a world-class way is when you do include these sorts of things.
Well, the group here would agree with you, Gordy. The majority of the group said moderately that succession planning and talent development are regular components of the assessment, even though it's not the primary focus. And then it's a bit split between some who have this as an extensive part of the risk assessment, as well as those who have it minimally part of the discussion. Pleased to see that there's not that many that fall into the not at all, because our point of view is that when you think about an organization's risk as a whole, as part of the comp committee, talent and what you're doing with that talent, especially in terms of succession planning, is really core to making sure that you're minimizing the risk for the organization. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So we're going to speak a little bit here about the dynamics of CEO succession and why the risk assessment then is really critical to make sure that the organization's in a good spot. And so if succession is part of the risk assessment and part of the discussion for the comp committee, it tends to be more likely that it's around CEO succession and not as much executive succession, but that can also pose a risk. So when you see here, talent is more likely to come from the inside. 78% of CEO appointments were internal between 2018 and 2022. So having the discussion around how ready are people, what are we doing about them, who are our high potentials, is going to better set up an organization to be better prepared to have some candidates move forward. And there's turnover that's happening here. 10% of global companies experience CEO turnover. So that's an average of 181 CEOs turning over per year. It might not be your organization this year, and you might have it planned for, but some of that's also unplanned. 86% of these transitions are planned, which means it should be a topic of discussion from our point of view in terms of what risk level do you have based on the remaining tenure of that CEO. But 7% are health related and 7% were under pressure. So that's 14% of these 10% turnovers that aren't planned. And so without having a plan, you're planning to fail. And so having that as part of the risk here is the risk assessment is important. And then lastly here, there's a lot of implications for boards in how CEOs are onboarded. Ineffective CEO transitions cost roughly $1 trillion a year. That's an incredible expense to organizations. And our point of view is that having succession planning as a point in the risk assessment will greatly reduce the chances of putting in a candidate who's either not ready, but it's the only candidate you have, so an internal mismatch, or not having any choices internally and having to go with an unknown quantity externally. I have an example of a client who had this as part of their risk assessment. They knew their CEO was 2 to 3 years out. It came time, they saw in the risk assessment, they discussed as part of the risk assessment that they didn't have somebody ready in 2 to 3 years. So they did go externally to hire a couple of options and put them into senior level roles so that they had the time to be able to develop them. But that came up as part of the risk assessment discussion. It also allows you to get to know insider candidates, this robust succession planning process, and to also understand the experience of first-time CEOs. Many of you have been with a first-time CEO, I'm sure, and that comes with its own set of complications, right? It's lonely at the top. There's a part of new and different situations. And so with the proper planning and attending to that risk, that learning curve can be shortened so that the new CEO is more ready than he or she may have been otherwise for that role. So Gordy, I'd like to have you tell us where you've seen things go really well in terms of planning for succession, how that was either a part of the risk assessment discussion or when you've just been part of an organization that did it really well, and what was the outcome?
Yeah, so when you do it really well, I would say probably 4 or 5 years out from when you think the CEO might be changing, is when the board starts having a conversation about, okay, who are our next sort of group of succession candidates, and with the idea that when you get to the point in time where you want to make that decision, you have at a minimum 2 and sometimes 3 or even 4 potential candidates to contemplate to step in the chair as chief executive. In order for that to work, you really have to be thinking about it about 3 years in advance. And the reason I say that is because as the candidates are being assessed and they're being developed, you might need to make a change, move one person from one job to another or otherwise, and they need to have time to actually sit in that role and live with some of their decisions and live with some of their mistakes. So you have to be doing that somewhere between 2 and 4 years in advance, at least what your thinking is. And so that's where I've seen it the best. The absolute worst is when you get caught flat-footed, somebody doesn't work out or something happens, and now you don't really have the right kind of candidates, and you're now sort of struggling to find out how you're going to get that role filled, go outside, hire the search firm, and those are high risk circumstances. Those are really high risk circumstances, which I'm sure people, everybody on this webinar can kind of relate to. Those are high risk circumstances. And that's when it costs you a ton of money, especially when you have a failure in that circumstance. It costs you a ton of money because you set up somebody with their long-term comp and everything else, and now you got to pay them a severance package too. And the public gets all pissed off because you're paying them too much to leave, and so you have all that.
Yes, absolutely. We have a client that we did a large CEO succession planning engagement with, and they did have 3. They had 3 horses in the race, they called them, because you have to plan for the unexpected there. You're going to have one person who may get poached during that time, right? You're going to have one person who may, midway through their accelerated development or as you've been testing them and developing them in certain ways, decides this isn't the job for me and I really don't want this. And then you have that third that hopefully is the one that's rising to the occasion. So we would, my experience would agree with that, Gordy, that 3 and even 4, if possible, is really the ideal number to strive for. And you don't do that planning 1 to 2 years out, right? You need at least ideally 2 to 3 years. 4 is better. That same organization, once that new CEO took his role, about 6 months later, we were talking again about his succession. He wasn't ready to leave. He just started, but he knows how important it is that, even if he's 5+ years out, to start looking at who is our strong bench strength in the organization.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I'll add, Lisa, so I'm an operations guy, I guess, at heart. And I think at the end of the day, discipline is what wins in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. And this is really just about discipline. It's about the board having the discipline with the CEO to say, we are going to talk about this at the right time. And the right time is not 2 years before it's time to make the decision. The right time is long before that. Have the discipline to sort of stay at it, keep talking about it, and work it so that you actually end up having the proper outcome.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Can we go to the next slide, please? So just a few more statistics that we wanted to breeze through on CEO succession and why this is so important to have as part of the risk assessment discussion. The average CEO tenure is actually declining. So that pairs well with that statistic we heard before, right? That people are moving through the role at a quicker pace, which means succession is now happening more often in these organizations. The average age of CEOs that are departing, however, is rising. That's not unexpected given some periods of uncertainty in the markets and the economy. So folks are curious to see what's coming and aren't necessarily as confident in stepping down at that time, which means proactively succession planning and engaging those senior leaders is going to be critical, because if CEOs are staying longer, then some of that high potential talent that's looking for the job is going to be looking elsewhere potentially. So really engaging them and demonstrating that that you're invested in their development. Failure rates tend to be similar for new CEOs, externally and internally. It really depends on the company's performance. That comes as no surprise. In better performing companies, the failure rate is about half of what it would be in underperforming companies. 48% of CEOs stayed on as board chairs after their departures as of 2022, which is actually down 63%, but higher than what it was in 2020. So it's really varying how long CEOs are choosing to stay on boards and as part of the organization's governance. So again, this risk, assessing the risk for their transition, given he or she may not stay, is even more important. I see you nodding your head, Gordy.
Yeah, it's just really hard for the new CEO to have the old CEO and chair sort of stay on the board. It's just really, really hard. So I'm not a big fan of that unless it's sort of short. The old CEO always casts a shadow over the system, whether we want to admit it or not. So I'm not a big fan of doing that very long. I understand the necessity for it from a continuity standpoint and transition, but I wouldn't do it very long personally.
So with that, we have our last polling question. Thank you, Gordy. And our last polling question is, so to what extent has your comp committee discussed the risk of failed succession planning? Is it a regular part of the discussion? Has it been a topic of discussion that's sometimes discussed or not at all? And Gordy, when you've been part of these comp committee risk discussions, do you talk more about what happens when it fails or more just about making sure you have succession planning in general? What's your experience been there?
Yeah, what I would say is that, and I've probably done now 8 CEO successions one way or the other around and through. What's interesting is we actually haven't talked about a failed CEO succession as a part of the risk assessment conversation. It's more in the context of what we need to have the company be successful. So there's a handful of things that the board's responsible for. CEO succession is one of those 3 or 4 things. And so we have to have it on our agenda all the time. And so it actually, I don't think we necessarily talk about it specifically in the context of the risk discussion. It's more, hey, this is one of our core jobs, one of our core responsibilities. We're going to talk about this regularly. We're going to make sure it gets done right and have the right discipline to ensure that we execute it properly. So I'd say that's the context of the discussion. And, there've been several times when, as you go through and you've assessed the candidates, you understand their successes and failures. If you don't put belts and suspenders, or if you don't put support around their weaknesses, then you have a much higher potential that the risk of they're going to fail. So you have to do that. You have to do those assessments, and we're both in that kind of business. It's necessary to do that, and so. The risk of a failure is a big deal, and the board has accountability for that.
And that was the majority of the answers here as well. So option B, it's been a topic of discussion, was the majority, followed very closely by some, but not regularly. And it's most likely due to that fact Gordy is talking about, making sure that they're set up for success. I want to make sure that we leave enough time for Q&A at the end. So I'll go to the last slide here. And Gordy, you just said it's more about making sure they have the right skills and experiences. So you set this up perfectly. Thank you. There's 4 groupings of skills and experiences that are best practice from our perspective in assessing internal candidate readiness for these roles. Whether they have the CEO level leadership capability, learning agility, what's that transition risk look like for the first time CEO, what we just talked about? And then what are those CEO level skills and experiences. They've either led through change, how they manage their different constituents, et cetera. So when Gordy and I were chatting, we had a discussion around learning agility and how learning agility is really a critical component when you're looking at a leader's potential. So Gordy, talk to us a little bit about how you've seen learning agility play a role in CEOs or executives that you've put into positions.
Yeah, so what I'd say is that at the end of the day, you don't know that job until you actually sit in it. Whether you do it as an interim or any other circumstance, you don't know what it's like in the chair until you're actually in the chair. You don't know what it's like to be the bottleneck when something's sitting on your desk and the whole organization is waiting for you to make a decision until you're actually sitting there doing that. And so the ability to get in the chair and be able to learn very quickly both what your role is, how you're going to execute that, and then be able to sort of look out on the horizon because you're the only one accountable to do that. Being able to assess that and understand that for the people who become chief executive, to me, is a really, really critical skill and capability. Mm-hmm. And I've seen it on companies large and small, right? A new person steps in. If they can't be a learner, the company is screwed. They have to be a learner. It's a critical skill set.
Agreed. Thank you. So I'm going to turn it back over to Stephen to take us home here with some key takeaways from today, and then we'll get in a little Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So just some quick closing thoughts. What did we talk about today? Number one, we talked about expanding the risk assessment to include broad-based plans. Think about how succession planning and talent development even play into the compensation risk assessment. Let's learn from scandals. We don't need to wait for a material risk failure to occur at our organization to react to it. We can see what's happening in the market. Monitor continuously. The comp risk assessment isn't something that needs to be done just at the time of year that it happens to pop up on the agenda. Let's think about risk throughout the year. And leverage expertise. Use your compensation consultants. Use other compensation experts in your network to make sure that you're checking for ongoing updates and best practices. And now I think we'll open to Q&A.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions here. The first one, and either Steve or Lisa, you can handle this. How is the compensation risk assessment communicated? In your experience, how is that communicated?
So I think there's really two lenses to look at this through. One, how it's communicated externally, and two, how it's communicated to the compensation committee. When we think about how it's communicated externally, as I mentioned before, a lot of the time it's simply a paragraph or two within your proxy disclosure that states a compensation risk assessment was conducted. Maybe you go a step further and describe the process behind that compensation risk assessment, and you arrive at your conclusion of whether material adverse risk was identified within the compensation program. But when it's communicated internally, when you actually sit down with your compensation committee and go through it in detail, I find that to be a much more thorough process. And that's really, when we go back to the idea of transparency, that's primarily so that your compensation committee has insight into how the compensation risk assessment was conducted. And that might come in the form of a 10 to 15 page compensation risk assessment report, where we lay out the different areas of assessment, whether it's through compensation strategy and philosophy, incentive plan design, the security arrangements that are present within our compensation plans, the governance guidelines that exist within the compensation plans. The compensation committee itself gets a much more thorough readout and review of the compensation risk assessment, generally more through that spectrum approach that we discussed, whereas the external communication is more compliance oriented, that we did conduct this risk assessment and we were thoughtful about how we approached it.
So I know we're about to run out of time, but let me just touch on one other really quick question. If you guys can just give me a binary answer to this. If you discover a problem in the plan, how quickly should you mitigate it? Should you jump on it instantly or wait till the comp cycle sort of rolls over?
Well, Lisa, I'll turn it to you. If you identify a risk, say, in your succession plan, when's the best time to address that?
Your next meeting. It's never too early to address whether there is a succession. When you see a problem, you jump on it, because time is a limited resource when it comes to succession planning. And so when you identify it, we would suggest addressing that as quickly as possible within the group so that you can determine the right steps forward.
Great. Thanks, guys.
All right. So with that, I just want to take a moment to thank Steve, Lisa, and Gordy, especially you, for providing us that director voice and your experience, and for all of your expertise. While we did run out of time, if you did submit a question in the Q&A box, we will go ahead and have the panel follow up to your question via email. I do have a couple of quick reminders before we conclude the program. John, if we can go to the next slide. I just want to remind folks that our next compensation series webinar will take place on November 12th. It will be at 2 p.m. again, so keep an eye out on the NACD events page, our webinar page, to register. And if you want to find this or previous webinars in the series, just visit our archives at nacdonline.org/webinars. Pearl Meyer also keeps it on their site on pearlmeyer.com/insights-and-research. And before we let you go, I want to please remind you to fill out the evaluation form. And this is both here and in the link that comes in the follow-up email. As I mentioned before, this feedback is so important for us to improve our webinar series. So with that, this concludes our program. I want to thank you all again for joining us and have a wonderful afternoon.